we are extremely happy to have with us Victor Madrigal Borloz. Although he wore little introductions, I will just remind us all that Victor is a lawyer from Costa Rica and the current UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. His 3-year term is coming to an end at the end of 2020, and during this period, he has taken numerous initiatives to fight against human rights violations related to sexual orientation and gender identity, amongst others on the role of data and information collection, marginalization and exclusion from social, cultural, and economic environments, access to health, education, and housing, and stigmatization and pathologization. Besides his work with the United Nations, Victor is a senior visiting researcher at the Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program and has occupied other leading roles in international institutions and NGOs. It is my honor to give the floor to Victor Madrigal Borloz. Thank you so much for joining us, Victor.
Thank you very much, Nuno, and I wish to thank you very warmly for this generous invitation to share with you some thoughts today. I know that this conference has been going on for a while, and I have made a point of trying to understand as much as I can the conversations that you have undertaken. I am very sorry that I wasn't able to accompany the full length of the proceedings, but as you may know, the Human Rights Council generously projected my dialogue to actually occur during this 2 or 3 days. I began on Tuesday and I finalized just 30 minutes ago having my interactive dialogue with the states of the Human Rights Council, and that is the reason why I haven't been able to be with you. But I know the importance of this conference, and I know it intimately, not only in my position as independent expert on protection from violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, but also because I come to this conversation with a particular experience as having been the Secretary General of the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims, and a sector which I believe has significant intersectionalities with the conversation that you've been having over the last few days. And therefore, I know that you will know that it's not only my great honor, but also my great pleasure to be in this forum today. And importantly, I hope to be able to present to you some of the aspects of the work of the mandate of the independent expert that create an intersection with your work. And I am very much looking forward to the conversation that will ensue, so as to better understand how the mandate can be put at the service of the human rights concerns of asylum seekers, refugees, and also in these days, of course, general populations on the move. So, Nuno, my proposal to you is that I will try to take you in a quick trip around the mandate of the independent expert and its intersection with work concerning these issues, and then hopefully we can open for dialogue. Having said that, I happen to know that in the group today, there's a significant number of people who have intimate knowledge of the mandate of the independent expert, and I don't want to let the opportunity go without expressing my respect, my acknowledgement, and my admiration for Professor Vitit MUNTABHORN, who was the first independent expert and the person who provided the mandate with the theoretical framework for which it has been running for basically as long as both Professor MUNTABHORN and I have had the honor of having this position. Nuno, I believe that I am able to share my screen, which is what I will attempt to do right now. Please bear with me for a second as I do that. And you should be seeing now a slide entitled Mandate of the Independent Expert SOGI. I'm looking at you, Nuno, is that correct? Are you looking at the slide? Thank you. So I would like to bring your attention to the fact that the Resolution 32, which is the basis of the mandate of the independent expert, is of course a construction of compromise, a political compromise in what was in fact a very controversial and delicate negotiation in which the world was, we could say, fractured in two. Those states that were extremely acrimoniously saying that the creation of this mandate was a way to promote homosexuality around the world, and another group of states which were very much hoping to ascertain the principle that sexual orientation and gender identities are points of entry in the examination of violence and discrimination and in the dissection of this phenomenon so as to be able to address it. So I never really take point of departure in the political construction of the resolution because it is, like any political exercise, a convoluted set of compromises, but I have distilled that into what I think are the 6 basic functions of what the independent expert is mandated to do: analyze the situation of violence and discrimination, advise states, alert UN organs and bodies, particularly the Human Rights Council, advocates for the rights of LGBT persons, gender diverse persons, and persons belonging to sexual diversity, activating and mobilizing local and international communities, and of course, following up on the recommendations created for the mandate. And I hope that now you're looking at a little drawing. I'm not very good at using computer software to draw, so this I drew myself. This is the way that the mandate is structured. And the reason why I would like to present you with this is that you will very quickly see how there's a number of points of connections that can be drawn immediately to concerns of refugees, asylum seekers, and other people on the move. The 2 main functions of the work of the independent expert is, on the one hand, to increase visibility of violence and discrimination. So to bring examples and analytical frameworks as to how violence and discrimination occurs in the everyday life of people, and then advising states on the effective measures that can be taken to address those phenomena of violence and discrimination. The business of the independent expert is the business of state responsibility. And therefore, we are very much looking at advice in relation to legislation, access to justice, and public policy. That is to say, the manner in which the state carries out its business. To do that, to comply with its functions, at the center of which there is, of course, the human person, the individual whose life we want to actually make an improvement on, we have the working methods. And that includes communications, allegations of human rights violations, country visits, thematic research, and the overarching theme of dialogue. All of those functions and working methods converge in a series of outputs that the mandate can produce. That can be letters of concern in relation to allegations of human rights violations, reports on country visits, policy statements, and reports in relation to thematic research. Those are the main outputs of the mandate. All of these outputs are produced around what I call the framework of the mandate, and we can see here the underpinnings created by Professor Vitit MUNTABHORN. The study of criminalization, it is of course acknowledged that criminalization is a major determinant in violence and discrimination. And we've had plenty of opportunity now of assessing how criminalization has an impact on persecution and actual violence, and therefore producing the phenomenon of persons fleeing and actually seeking asylum elsewhere. We also know that anti-discrimination measures are instrumental in promoting social inclusion. And these are two of the underpinnings promoted by Professor MUNTABHORN. The issue of pathologization, or the notion that LGBT people are sick and their existences are sick, are particularly important also in creating phenomena of violence that will lead to well-fundamented fear of persecution for persons. And of course, absence of recognition of gender identity is another trigger for violence and discrimination. All of them connected very much with the issue of social exclusion and inclusion that is part of the MUNTABHORN underpinnings. To those, I added one, which underlined the concerns raised by Professor MUNTABHORN, but in relation to which I did a particular report, and that is the concern on data. Data and sexual orientation and gender identity are a particular area of challenge. My findings in relation to this issue is that all throughout the board, states do not gather systematically data concerning sexual orientation and gender identity. They don't gather it in relation to violence and discrimination, and they don't gather it in relation to social exclusion from major sectors such as education, work, housing, or health, all of which leads to phenomena of either complete rupture or partial exclusion from the sectors that are related to this issue. The absence of data also becomes a significant factor when it is used in certain contexts as part of an argument to define what is considered to be a safe country of origin. And this is something that concerns me greatly, because to me, it is absolutely unimaginable how certain countries in Europe have declared that a country like Uganda, where criminalization exists and where there are very, very well fundamented and identified patterns of persecution, how it actually has been declared to be a safe country of origin in some cases. And I am sure that you have been exploring this issue during your conference, Nuno, and I would very much like to understand how to create links in relation to these issues. We all know, of course, that gathering data is particularly difficult when it concerns people on the move, some of which may not be in a particular interest to reveal where is their first point of entry to particular contexts. And of course, we have been looking very much at this issue when it comes to the latest migration crisis, particularly in relation to Syrian refugees and asylum seekers. I developed great areas of concern about the absence of mechanisms of safe data and collection to people who were coming in ports of entry in Southern Europe and then making their ways to countries in Northern Europe, but still very, very uninterested to reveal their particular data to data gathering points in their journey, precisely because of mechanisms such as the Dublin mechanism and so on and so forth. And I would very much like to hear about these issues in your and how they related to your conversations. The current and future research agenda developed by the mandate has significant points of connection with what you've been concerning yourselves with. At the moment, I'm just promoting, I just finalized half an hour ago presenting to the Human Rights Council my report on conversion therapy, which has led me to understand that conversion therapy is a pervasive practice in many countries around the world, and in which one could actually begin to interrogate how data can be used to understand how it relates to phenomena and legal qualifications such as well-fundamented fear of persecution. Then you have COVID-19, and I am working at the moment on my report to General Assembly on 2020, which I will present in October in New York, or virtually to an assembly, virtually supposed to be happening in New York. And I am concerned and also fascinated to receive information of reports of organizations that are concerned specifically with LGBT refugees and asylum seekers. And I have been analyzing them, and I'm pretty certain at this moment that there will be a specific thematic heading in that report dedicated to refugees and asylum seekers and their particular relation to COVID-19. There are other aspects of the thematic agenda that have connection with this issue. I would draw your attention to my reports in 2022 that will actually be dealing with issues of colonialism and religion. And I'm particularly interested to understand how these dynamics will be relating in some ways with right of asylum and dynamics concerning refugees and asylum seekers. I'd like to mention to you that the mandate's methodology is very much based not only on dialogue, but very importantly on the idea of intersectionality. We all embody many identities in one body that create particular and unique experiences of privilege, but also experiences of discrimination. And in very many cases, the balance between one and other is clearly tilted towards the experience of discrimination. And I think that when persons live in the intersection of asylum and refugeehood and LGBT identities, they are, of course, disproportionately impacted by mechanisms of exclusion and discrimination. I was able to deal with this issue in particularly when we crafted a policy statement in the year of 2019 with the Assistant High Commissioner for Refugees, at that stage Volker Turk, in which we highlighted the unique vulnerability and specific needs of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, and gender diverse asylum seekers and refugees. The fact that our understanding was that trauma and persecution start well before their actual flight to safety, and that criminalization existing at the origin plays a very clear role in creating contexts of persecution and exclusion. And finally, the nature of this journey to safety as being particularly treacherous for refugees and asylum seekers who continue to face prejudice and violence in countries of transit and also host countries. And here I'd like to underline the particular problematic that I think is very clear to many of you, which is the fact that LGBT persons, it's been my particular concern that they face possibilities of persecution and violence, not only in the context of countries of transit and reception, but also in refugee camps and detention centers. And the very, very difficult dynamics that this creates is of particular concern to the mandate. At that moment, in relation to that policy statement, we were particularly interested in suggesting the incorporation of LGBTI sensitive measures into asylum procedures, sensitive and culturally appropriate training on sexual orientation and gender identity, ensuring the assessment of the protection needs of each individual while transit and arrival in destination countries, as well as access to adequate housing in safe settings with adequate sanitation facilities. And here, I would like to highlight something that I know you have been talking about and which concerns me greatly, and frankly is something that I would like for us to brainstorm on how it can be solved, which is the use of very well-established methodologies in some countries of Europe, Istanbul Protocol examinations, for example. As you may know, there is now a whole movement towards updating Istanbul Protocol examinations to include gender-specific concerns. It's a movement that has been led by Professor Juan Mendez, former UN rapporteur on torture. But I am worried about the phenomenon of evidentiary inflation in relation to the use of Istanbul Protocol examinations. I have close contact with my very, very dear and respected colleagues of UK organizations, and they all have expressed to me their concern about the fact that the administrative and judiciary is asking for Istanbul Protocol examinations to be every time more extended, more concrete, to the point where you have now Istanbul Protocol examinations that have 120 pages and where more information is required. And organizations such as Freedom from Torture, which were able to carry out hundreds and hundreds of Istanbul Protocol examinations every year, now face the problem of being restricted to carry out substantially less because of the phenomenon of evidentiary inflation. And I think that is a problem that needs to be dealt with very carefully by this movement. And I'm very sure that you have discussed this during your conversation. So I hope to understand exactly how it is that you're suggesting that this could be dealt with. So this is part of the policy statements that I was able to do. Now, I wanted to give you another example of the way that my functions come. This is, of course, not in Europe, which I know is the remit of your work, but it's where it presented. I have been very concerned, of course, by information coming from Kenya in relation to the alleged act of violence, harassment, and discrimination against LGBT refugees living in particular in the Kakuma camp. But of course, one of the particular issues that I am very much aware is that this may be very well what is a paradigmatic and emblematic example of what happens in very many other contexts, and I would venture to say probably in all refugee camps around the world, and is the repetition of contexts of persecution, stigma, and discrimination in relation to camps. We created a joint action letter amongst a number of mandate holders in relation to this issue. And the thing that is interesting about this process is that it provides for follow-up not only with the Kenyan state, but also with the UNHCR. And I think that it has become a very interesting tool for follow-up in relation to these issues. And I could imagine that it's a little bit of maybe a blueprint in relation to how these situations may be managed in the future. Next, I wanted to give you an example of a particular treatment on this issue on a country visit. Now, I always endeavor to meet with refugees and asylum seekers whenever I'm in a given country. And so far, both states that I visit, but also UNHCR and other entities participating in this type of processes have been very helpful in providing this kind of access. This is a number of extracts from my report to Mozambique, where I was able to meet with a number of refugees living in the Maratane refugee camp. And again, in this case, they were coming from contexts of criminalization, mostly from the region of the Great Lakes, but also they were coming from countries of armed conflict, where high levels of violence, including sexual and gender-based violence, were very much of the rule. And again, repeating the very, very worrisome and concerning pattern about prejudice and sexual violence also existing in the camp. and also a very clear absence of mechanisms of access to justice, be administrative or judicial, existing in the camp. In this particular case of Maratane, that had 10,000 people living in it, there were 4 police officers doing the whole policing of the camp. So basically the structure was one of self-administration, self-security, something that was very concerning to UNHCR and to myself. So I'll stop there for a second, coming back to myself. Hopefully now I'm back. Am I back, Nuno? And then I will mention something else, but I wanted to let you know that I think that in a very clear way, the mandate has already been in a position to understand how a clearly defined agenda comes together and becomes very evident when we deal with issues concerning the right of asylum and refugeehood. And again, I always say also the wider context of people in the move, just to be able to capture in very many senses, in particularly in relation to the great movements, particularly the last ones concerning Syria, trying to capture also other persons. What is it that concerns me in particular when it comes to Europe? What concerns me is that the last 10 years have shown us a confluence of political concern, of the agglomeration of the idea of refugeehood issues, migration issues, torture victim issues into one package that has been tainted politically with the whole discussion around migration that has politically determined a lot of the political discourse in Europe, and that unfortunately, as we all know, has been received in very many of the political processes in Europe. And this creates a phenomenon where these issues are now more difficult to discuss, less well received by parties in the center, even by parties in the left center, and very poorly documented because they are not politically profitable. And I think that this is an issue that is very, very difficult, and of course, quite more difficult when it concerns populations in which stigma is compounded. And this is how we came to the beginning of 2020, with that agenda that in and of itself was complex. We come then to the pandemic, to a situation where the situation of LGBT persons has been particularly affected by the pandemic because of 3 main reasons. One, because of the exacerbation of political narratives that place them at the center of either the blaming for the pandemic. In very many countries of the world, leaders are saying that the pandemic is the responsibility of same-sex marriage or the existence of rights for LGBT persons, or because the pandemic becomes an excuse for persecution against LGBT persons. All of you know that I'm on the record in relation to the infamous Article 33 of the omnibus legislation in Hungary, which is basically a measure, I believe, of persecution that has been issued in the context of pandemic, when you don't see it, there's no way to seeing any kind of connection. Hungary, of course, an enormously important country when we look at transit of migratory and refugee flows. So extremely complicated narratives coming into there. The second aspect in which the pandemic has interacted particularly in a difficult way in these populations is the indirect discrimination or indirect impact of measures that, even if not designed in a discriminatory intent, have not been designed having populations consulted. And therefore, when they are implemented, they are having discriminatory impact. And I place here measures such as those that have had certain community or security leaders involved in the distribution of hygienic or food packages, when those leaders are sometimes repeating patterns of discrimination and abuse. That's one example, but there's many in relation to this. And of course, then the third aspect is the aspect of the fact that LGBT people did not come to this pandemic on a level ground. They came with poorer outcomes and in a situation of systemic exclusion from all sectors of life. And therefore, the repetition, I think it's actually quite important, there's a particular affectation in relation to this. All of this brings me to what I already had the opportunity to signal in relation to exclusion of LGBT persons, which is embodied in my report in my thematic report on social inclusion. And it's actually the finding about the fact that the structural vulnerabilities of LGBT persons are compounded, or may be compounded, I said in the report, by their status as migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, that there needed to be a keen understanding that these persons need to deploy, devise, create a number of strategies for survival and understanding what they rely on, and in a particular point, that access to LGBT-sensitive healthcare and reproductive rights and services would be particularly challenging for LGBT people on the move in all stages and at all times during their journeys. And I established, of course, the fact that stigma and discrimination strongly discourage migrants, internally displaced persons, asylum seekers, refugees, and migrant workers from disclosing sexual orientations and gender identities, that migratory detention is particularly harmful to them, and of course the situation of unaccompanied LGBT children. Nobody has any doubt as to where is the context that I was making mention of that to. I have great concerns in the northern triangle of Central America, and migratory refugee and asylum seekers coming from that area of the world. And finally, the extreme vulnerability of trans sex workers. So all of this, I believe, was compounded in the coming of the pandemic, for which I created the ASPIRE guidelines. ASPIRE guidelines are a series of recommendations to government that are based on 6 principles. A stands for acknowledging that LGBT people are everywhere. And that means also in the refugee and migrant and asylum seeker populations. Sorry, I didn't mean to compound them that way, but in refugee and asylum seekers for sure. Secondly, that civil society needs to be supported, and it needs to be supported also in their specialty and in their ability to continue working also in political advocacy. I'm greatly concerned about this idea that civil society can just transform themselves into humanitarian agencies. That's not what they're called to do. So investing in the continued ability of civil society to maintain their position as political advocates and not transform themselves into humanitarian responders is very important, I believe. Third, P stands for protect, ensure that the pandemic is not used as an excuse to attack persons, to further undermine their rights. I stand for indirect discrimination. It's a real risk. It needs to be assessed. I already spoke about that. R stands for representation, but I am clearly, acutely aware of the challenges that that represents within the populations and communities of asylum seekers and refugees. And this is why I think that survivor-led groups, such as Survivor Speaks Out, again, another example of the United Kingdom, are particularly important in this connection, but also the groups that I have been talking to when I visit countries, and are the groups living in camps and under the conditions is very important. And finally, E in aspire, E stands for evidence-based approaches. Data needs to be gathered. The UNHCR is doing quite an important work in relation to that. I know that this is a lot of what Sojika, I don't know if I'm doing it, if I'm pronouncing it right, no. I know that this is a lot of what Sojika is about, is how do you gather data, how do you marry, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to marry you with anyone, but how do you marry the sector of research and activism, and how do you bring evidence and data for advocacy purposes, right? That's a lot of what this program is about. And so I'm delighted and very enthused and excited to hear those answers. And I am delighted to imagine that this opportunity is the first sentence in a conversation amongst us. Because if nothing else, what you can absolutely be sure about is that I am keen to learn from everything that you now have discussed and worked together, so that I can bring that into the knowledge that the mandate, into the knowledge base of the mandate. And that there are significant spaces where this mandate can be what in Spanish we would call a resonance box for the work that you do. I want you to know again that it is a great honor to be here, that I am delighted to have been able to have this point of intersection, albeit imperfect. Again, the blame is to be placed on the United Nations Human Rights Council. I'll give you their address at any time. But I am delighted that we were able to create this point of intersection, because I hope that it is clear to you how important I consider your work and how delighted I am at the prospect of being able to work with it. Thank you so much, Nuno.
Thank you so much, Victor. It was very, very inspiring and reassuring to see not only how wonderful your work has been, which I was already aware of, but also how aware you are of all the intersections with LGBT plus refugees, and you see all this potential to inform your mandate with all these issues and the work that is being done by activists and researchers and so on in this field.